Maple Hill was the kind of neighborhood where perfection wasn't just an aspiration, it was an expectation. Nestled in the heart of an affluent suburb, it was a place where the streets were lined with towering oak trees. The houses were sprawling estates with manicured lawns, and the cars in the driveways were always the latest models. It was a community where appearances mattered above all else, where the smiles were as polished as the silverware at dinner parties, and where secrets were buried so deep they might as well have never existed. At the center of this world was the Harrington estate, a sprawling mansion that stood as a testament to the power and prestige of its owners, Richard and Evelyn Harrington. The house was a marvel of modern architecture, with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in the golden light of the setting sun, a grand staircase that seemed to gleam under the chandelier's glow, and a backyard that could have been mistaken for a botanical garden. It was the kind of home that made people stop and stare, the kind of home that whispered of success and sophistication. Evelyn Harrington was the queen of Maple Hill, with her flawless blonde hair, designer wardrobe, and a smile that could charm even the most hardened cynic. She was the epitome of grace and elegance. She was the kind of woman who could command a room with a single glance, who could make you feel like the most important person in the world with just a few well-chosen words. She hosted charity galas, chaired committees, and was the face of every major social event in the community. Her Instagram was a curated gallery of perfection. Photos of her at glamorous events, her children in matching outfits, her home looking like something out of a magazine spread. She was the standard to which all others aspired, the embodiment of the Maple Hill dream. Her husband, Richard Harrington, was equally admired, a self-made businessman who had built a fortune in real estate development. He was the kind of man who exuded confidence and power, with his sharp suits, commanding presence, and a smile that could be both charming and intimidating. He was the kind of man who inspired respect and envy in equal measure. Together, Richard and Evelyn were the golden couple, the standard-bearers of success and sophistication. They were the couple everyone wanted to be, the couple everyone wanted to know. But behind the polished facade of the Harrington estate lay secrets darker than anyone could imagine. Secrets that, if uncovered, would shatter the illusion of perfection and send shockwaves through the community. It was a crisp autumn evening when the first crack appeared in the Harringtons' perfect world. The annual Maple Hill Charity Gala was in full swing, and the Harrington mansion was alive with the sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft strains of a string quartet. The event was the highlight of the social calendar, a night when the who's who of Maple Hill came together to celebrate their success and generosity. The guest list was a who's who of the elite, CEOs, politicians, celebrities, and socialites, all dressed to the nines and eager to see and be seen. Evelyn, resplendent in a crimson gown that hugged her figure like a second skin, moved through the crowd with practiced ease. She greeted guests with a warmth that felt genuine, even if it wasn't, her smile never wavering as she exchanged pleasantries and accepted compliments on the evening's success. She was in her element, the center of attention, the star of the show. But beneath the surface, there was a restlessness, a sense of dissatisfaction that she couldn't quite shake. Marco, one of the household staff, watched her from the shadows. He was young, handsome, and had been working for the Harringtons for just over a year. Like many of the staff, he was an immigrant, lured to the United States with promises of a better life. But the reality of working for the Harringtons was far from the dream he had been sold. Long hours, low pay, and the constant fear of losing his job kept him in line. But there was something else, something darker, that bound him to the Harrington household. As the night wore on, Evelyn found herself drawn to Marco. It started with a glance, a fleeting moment of connection that sent a shiver down her spine. She told herself it was nothing, just the wine and the excitement of the evening. But as the hours passed, the tension between them grew, until it was impossible to ignore. It was in the library, away from prying eyes, that the line was finally crossed. Evelyn, emboldened by champagne and the thrill of rebellion, kissed Marco with a desperation that surprised even herself. Marco, torn between fear and desire, hesitated for a moment before giving in. It was a mistake, a moment of weakness that would change everything. Unbeknownst to them, someone had seen everything. A guest, wandering the halls in search of a bathroom, had stumbled upon the scene and captured it on their phone. By morning, the video had been leaked to the press, and the scandal of Maple Hill had begun. The news spread like wildfire. By midday, the video was everywhere, on social media, on the news, on the lips of every gossip in Maple Hill. Evelyn Harrington, the paragon of virtue, had been caught in a compromising position with one of her staff. The community was in shock. Richard, who had been away on business, returned home to find his wife in tears and his reputation in tatters. He was furious, not just at Evelyn, but at the world for daring to judge them. "We'll get through this," he told her, his voice cold and detached. "We always do." But as the days passed, it became clear that this was not a scandal that could be swept under the rug. The press was relentless, and the rumors were growing wilder by the day. Some claimed that Evelyn and Marco had been carrying on an affair for months. Others suggested that Richard had known all along and had turned a blind eye to protect his image. Amid the chaos, Claire Bennett, an investigative journalist with a knack for uncovering the truth, began to dig deeper. She had always suspected that there was more to the Harringtons than met the eye, and the scandal was the perfect opportunity to prove it. Claire's investigation led her to Marco, who was reluctant to talk at first. But as she gained his trust, he began to open up about the reality of working for the Harringtons. He spoke of the long hours, the low pay, and the constant fear of losing his job. But he also hinted at something darker, something he was too afraid to put into words. Claire's digging soon uncovered a web of corruption and exploitation that went far beyond the Harrington household. Richard's real estate empire was built on the backs of immigrant workers like Marco, who were paid a pittance and forced to work in dangerous conditions. Worse still, there were rumors of illegal activities, bribery, blackmail, and even human trafficking. As Claire pieced together the puzzle, the true extent of the Harringtons' crimes began to emerge. Evelyn, it seemed, had been complicit in covering up her husband's misdeeds, using her charm and influence to keep the truth hidden. But now, with the scandal threatening to destroy everything they had built, the cracks in their marriage were beginning to show. The morning after the charity gala, Maple Hill awoke to a storm. The video of Evelyn Harrington and Marco had gone viral overnight, spreading like wildfire across social media, news outlets, and gossip blogs. The Harrington estate, once a symbol of perfection, was now the epicenter of a scandal that threatened to tear the community apart. Evelyn sat in the sunlit breakfast nook of her mansion, her hands trembling as she scrolled through the headlines on her phone. Socialite caught in scandal with staff member. One read, "Maple Hill's golden couple tarnished," declared another. The comment sections were even worse, strangers speculating about her marriage, her character, her life. She felt exposed, violated, as though the walls of her carefully constructed world were crumbling around her. Richard, who had returned from his business trip early, stood by the window, his back to her. He hadn't said much since he'd walked through the door, but the tension in the room was palpable. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold and clipped. "How could you be so careless, Evelyn?" he demanded, turning to face her. His eyes were hard, his jaw clenched. "Do you have any idea what this could do to us? To our family? To my business?" Evelyn flinched at his tone, but said nothing. She had no defense, no explanation that would satisfy him. She had made a mistake, a terrible, irreversible mistake, and now they were both paying the price. By midday, the Harrington estate was under siege. Reporters and photographers camped out at the gates, their cameras trained on the house, waiting for a glimpse of the disgraced socialite. The phone rang incessantly, calls from friends, acquaintances, and journalists eager for a comment. Evelyn ignored them all, retreating to the sanctuary of her bedroom while Richard dealt with the fallout. But there was no escaping the scrutiny. The scandal dominated the news cycle, with pundits and commentators dissecting every detail of the video, speculating about the state of the Harringtons' marriage, and questioning what other secrets might be lurking behind the facade of their perfect life. In the days that followed, the scandal became the talk of Maple Hill. At the country club, the grocery store, and the school drop-off line, it was all anyone could talk about. The Harringtons, once the darlings of the community, were now the subject of whispers and judgment. "I always knew there was something off about her," one woman murmured to her friend over lattes at the local cafe. "No one's that perfect." Did you see the video? Another asked, her voice tinged with both shock and glee. I can't believe she'd risk everything for a fling with the help. Even those who had once counted themselves as friends began to distance themselves from the Harringtons, afraid of being tainted by association. Invitations dried up, phone calls went unanswered, and the once bustling Harrington estate became a ghost town. For Marco, the scandal was a nightmare. Overnight, he had gone from being an anonymous member of the household staff to the center of a media firestorm. Reporters hounded him, offering money for his story, while strangers speculated about his motives and his character. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and terrified of what might happen next. He had never intended for things to go this far. He had been flattered by Evelyn's attention, yes, but he had never imagined it would lead to this. Now he was caught in the crossfire, his life and livelihood hanging in the balance. When Richard summoned him to the study, Marco's heart pounded with fear. He had always been intimidated by Richard, with his cold demeanor and piercing gaze, but now, facing him in the wake of the scandal, he felt truly terrified. "Sit down," Richard said, his voice calm but laced with menace. Marco obeyed, perching on the edge of the chair as Richard paced the room. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Richard demanded, his eyes blazing. "You've ruined everything. My reputation, my business, my family, all of it, because of your stupidity." Marco opened his mouth to protest, to explain that it hadn't been entirely his fault, but Richard cut him off. "You're going to fix this," Richard said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're going to tell the press that it was all a misunderstanding, that nothing happened, and if you know what's good for you, you'll keep your mouth shut about anything else." Marco nodded, too frightened to argue, but as he left the study, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was in over his head. While the scandal dominated the headlines, Claire Bennett, an investigative journalist with a reputation for uncovering the truth, saw an opportunity. She had always been skeptical of the Harringtons, with their polished image and seemingly perfect lives. Now, with the scandal providing an opening, she was determined to dig deeper. Claire began her investigation by reaching out to Marco. At first, he was reluctant to talk, wary of Richard's threats and the potential consequences. But Claire was persistent, and over time, she gained his trust. "It's not just about the scandal," Marco told her during one of their meetings. "There's more to it. Things you wouldn't believe." Claire's interest was piqued. She pressed him for details, and slowly, the story began to unfold. Marco spoke of the long hours, the low pay, and the constant fear of losing his job. He spoke of the exploitation of immigrant workers, the dangerous working conditions, and the culture of silence that kept everyone in line. But he also hinted at something darker, something he was too afraid to put into words. As Claire dug deeper, she began to uncover a web of corruption and exploitation that went far beyond the Harrington household. Richard's real estate empire, it seemed, was built on the backs of immigrant workers like Marco, who were paid a pittance and forced to work in dangerous conditions. Worse still, there were rumors of illegal activities, bribery, blackmail, and even human trafficking. Claire's investigation led her to other workers, many of whom were too afraid to speak out. But with Marco's testimony and the evidence she had gathered, she began to piece together the truth. The Harringtons' empire was built on a foundation of exploitation and corruption, and Evelyn, it seemed, had been complicit in covering up her husband's misdeeds. As the scandal deepened, the cracks in the Harringtons' marriage began to show. Richard grew increasingly distant, consumed by the damage to his reputation and the threat to his business. Evelyn, meanwhile, felt isolated and betrayed, her once perfect life unraveling before her eyes. "How could you let this happen?" Richard demanded one evening, his voice cold and accusing. "Do you have any idea what this could cost us?" Evelyn, exhausted and emotionally drained, snapped, "This isn't just about me, Richard. You think I don't know about the things you've done? The lies, the secrets, the exploitation? You're just as much to blame for this mess as I am." Richard's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. The truth hung in the air between them, unspoken but undeniable. The breaking point came when Claire published her first article, exposing the dark secrets behind the Harringtons' empire. The piece was a bombshell, detailing the exploitation of immigrant workers, the illegal activities, and the culture of silence that had kept it all hidden. The reaction was immediate. The community was outraged, the press descended once more, and the Harringtons found themselves at the center of a firestorm. Richard was forced to confront the consequences of his actions, while Evelyn faced the reality of her complicity. The publication of Claire Bennett's exposé sent shockwaves through Maple Hill and beyond. The article, titled "Behind the Facade: The Dark Secrets of Maple Hill's Golden Couple," was a meticulously researched piece that laid bare the exploitation, corruption, and illegal activities at the heart of Richard Harrington's empire. It was a story of greed, power, and the human cost of maintaining a perfect image. For the Harringtons, the article was a death knell. The carefully constructed facade they had spent years building was crumbling, and there was no way to stop it. The morning the article was published, Richard Harrington's phone began ringing nonstop. Calls from business partners, investors, and lawyers flooded in, each one more urgent than the last. His real estate empire, once a symbol of his success, was now under scrutiny. Contracts were being canceled, investors were pulling out, and the media was camped outside his office, demanding answers. Richard sat at his desk, his head in his hands, as his lawyer briefed him on the situation. "We're looking at multiple lawsuits," the lawyer said, his tone grim. "Fraud, labor violations, breach of contract, the list goes on. And that's not even counting the criminal charges that could be coming." Richard's mind raced. He had always been careful, always covered his tracks. But now, with Claire's article shining a light on his darkest secrets, he felt exposed. He knew he had to act fast to contain the damage, but he wasn't sure where to start. While Richard dealt with the legal and financial fallout, Evelyn faced a reckoning of her own. The scandal had stripped away the veneer of perfection that had defined her life, leaving her feeling raw and vulnerable. She had always known about Richard's business practices, the exploitation, the corruption, the lies, but she had chosen to look the other way, telling herself it was necessary to maintain their lifestyle. Now, with the truth exposed, she could no longer ignore the moral cost of her complicity. She felt a deep sense of guilt, not just for her own actions, but for the role she had played in enabling Richard's behavior. One evening, as she sat alone in the dimly lit living room, she found herself scrolling through the comments on Claire's article. The words were harsh, judgmental, and often cruel, but they struck a chord. How could she live with herself, knowing what her husband was doing? One comment read, "She's just as guilty as he is," another said. Evelyn closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. She knew they were right. She had been complicit, and now she had to face the consequences. For Marco, the publication of Claire's article was both a relief and a source of anxiety. He had finally told the truth, but he knew it came with risks. Richard had threatened him, and he feared retaliation. But he also felt a sense of empowerment, knowing that his testimony had helped expose the truth. When Claire reached out to him after the article was published, he agreed to meet her again. This time, he was more open, more willing to share the details of his experience. It wasn't just about the long hours or the low pay, Marco told her. It was the way they treated us, like we were disposable, like we didn't matter. Claire listened intently, her heart breaking for the young man who had been so exploited. She knew his story was just one of many, and she was determined to give a voice to the others who had suffered in silence. In the days following the publication of Claire's article, more workers began to come forward. Some were current employees of Richard's company, while others were former workers who had left under difficult circumstances. Their stories were heartbreaking, tales of exploitation, abuse, and fear. One woman, Maria, spoke of being forced to work in unsafe conditions on one of Richard's construction sites. "I was pregnant at the time," she told Claire, her voice trembling. "I begged them to let me take it easy, but they said if I couldn't do the work, I'd be fired. I lost the baby a week later." Another man, Javier, described being threatened with deportation if he spoke out about the conditions. "They told us we should be grateful to have jobs," he said. "But how can you be grateful when you're treated like less than human?" As more stories emerged, the public outcry grew. Protests erupted outside Richard's office, with demonstrators demanding justice for the workers. The hashtag Justice for Maple Hill began trending on social media, and calls for a full investigation into Richard's business practices grew louder. With the pressure mounting, Richard's legal team scrambled to contain the damage. They issued statements denying the allegations, accusing Claire of sensationalism, and threatening legal action against anyone who defamed Richard's character. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the public wasn't buying it. Meanwhile, government agencies began to take notice. The Department of Labor launched an investigation into Richard's company, while the FBI looked into allegations of human trafficking and other criminal activities. Richard found himself facing not just civil lawsuits, but the very real possibility of criminal charges. As the legal battle raged on, Evelyn found herself at a crossroads. She knew she had to make a choice: continue to stand by Richard and risk being dragged down with him, or take a stand and do the right thing. One evening, she sat down with Claire and agreed to an interview. It was a difficult decision, but she knew it was the only way to begin making amends. "I've made a lot of mistakes," Evelyn admitted, her voice shaking. "I turned a blind eye to things I shouldn't have, and I enabled behavior that was wrong. I can't change the past, but I can take responsibility for my actions and try to make things right." The interview was published alongside Claire's follow-up article, and while it didn't absolve Evelyn of her complicity, it was a step toward accountability. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of relief, as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. In Maple Hill, the scandal continued to divide the community. Some stood by the Harringtons, refusing to believe the allegations or dismissing them as exaggerated. Others were outraged, calling for accountability and justice. At the country club, the grocery store, and the school drop-off line, the scandal was still the topic of conversation. But now the tone had shifted. People were beginning to question not just the Harringtons, but the systems and structures that had allowed such exploitation to happen in the first place. For Richard, the walls were closing in. The lawsuits, the investigations, the public outrage, it was all too much. He had always been a man who thrived on control, but now, he felt like he was losing his grip. One evening, as he sat alone in his study, he received a call from his lawyer. The news wasn't good. The Department of Labor had found evidence of widespread labor violations, and the FBI was preparing to file criminal charges. Richard hung up the phone, his hands trembling. He knew it was over. His empire, his reputation, his life, all of it was crumbling around him. The final blow came when Marco agreed to testify against Richard. With his testimony and the evidence Claire had gathered, the authorities were able to build a case against the Harringtons. Richard was arrested on charges of fraud, exploitation, and human trafficking, while Evelyn faced charges of obstruction of justice and conspiracy. The trial was a media circus, with every detail of the Harringtons' lives laid bare for the world to see. The community that had once idolized them now turned against them, their once impeccable reputation in ruins. In the end, Richard was sentenced to 25 years in prison, while Evelyn received a lighter sentence in exchange for her cooperation. The Harrington estate was sold to pay off their debts, and the once proud family was left with nothing. Marco, now free from the Harringtons' grip, started a new life, using his experience to advocate for the rights of immigrant workers. Claire's reporting won her numerous awards, and she continued to expose corruption wherever she found it. As for Maple Hill, the scandal served as a wake-up call. The community began to reckon with the darker side of its wealth and privilege, and slowly, things began to change. The scandal of Maple Hill was a reminder that even the most perfect facades can hide the darkest secrets. But it was also a story of redemption and justice, of ordinary people standing up to power and fighting for what was right. And in the end, that was what truly mattered.